you focused a lot on the interpretation or misinterpretation, translation of various religious texts and what that might mean in terms of whether or not Jesus Christ was condoning and supportive of the killing and consumption of animal foods, or was he in fact for animal liberation? And I feel like that's the part of the documentary that will probably shock or grab hold of the audience's attention the most. Do you think so?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, that's
the conversation generally gravitates towards that mostly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's from a historical perspective of just what's revealed in the film of, what started Christianity and Jesus, the most, the most famous, or how do you say the most?
Yeah, if you Google any list out there, most famous people in the world, Jesus is always at the top of the list. He's always number one.
And then that who he was and what he was really about and the movement he was part of has been covered up, and the true intentions and what they were all about and what he did 4 days before he got crucified has been covered up. And when you find out the whole story of what this movement and he was about, and how far did their compassion extend to and their activism extend to, and it's a massive transforming what it means to be Christian and a Christ follower. If you look into this and you find that this is indeed true, it's a massive shift in the religion.
That's sort of the reason how we even landed on the name, funny enough, is because when Kip and I teamed up, I come from the Christian background. I was obviously very focused on that side. But him coming from his background is shared in the film. We kind of covered different bases and went on this journey, but over time the film was called something else actually when we were working with our streamer. And then the more we went into the story and the more we put the film together, the more it naturally gravitated towards a through line with this Christ story, and hence why we landed on Christspiracy. So it's just, it definitely has a pull or a draw to it.
So you said you're Christian. So what are Christians taught about Jesus Christ and the consumption of meat?
Well, when I was growing up in church, a common phrase that we used to say, kind of a funny one, when we would go to meal after a church service would be, good food, good meat, good God, let's eat. It's kind of like a little laugh that everybody would get, but that does kind of sum it up. I was, you'll see in the film, I was a part of a Christian youth hunting club as a kid, going out to hunt wild animals. I was a part of a fishing club as well, went 40 miles offshore every year, catching fish. And then just in general, the church barbecue is just a staple. And within all of that, there's this notion, that kind of dominion notion, which is a word we discuss in the film, this idea that God's given us animals for us to eat as a part of our consumption. Depending on what day it is how much that element's focused on, but it's a general undercurrent,
Right. But you use the word cover up, and I think you use that in the film as well. So if I'm hearing this correctly, what you're saying is that there has been intentional misinterpretations of religious texts.
I mean, I would say whether it's intentional or not, it's hard to know. It's 2,000 years ago. There's people now, like my pastors, for instance, what we always like to share. We talk to my pastors, some of my childhood pastors in the film, and to their defense, they don't know a lot about this either. They've just been taught what they've been taught by the person who taught them all the way back, right? But most of the people now, I don't think they really realize that there is this other side to this story, or these other questions that could be raised in context with the scripture and the historical documents that we have, because it's just been so long ago. They're just doing what they know. But I do think, many, many years ago, 2,000 years ago, there were, I probably think, some intentional decisions, especially around the canonization of the Bible, which scriptures were included, certain groups that were there and how they were spoken about at the time. So we can get into some of that too.
And whereas the previous films worked on the conspiracy or the cover up is very now. Like when I'm speaking to someone from Greenpeace or Sierra Club or American Diabetes Association, I know that they know that there's a link, and they're consciously doing it, and and so it's very present with Seaspiracy too, all those companies. But with this film, when we're talking to these pastors, they don't even know what they don't even know. They've never even been asked this question, but there absolutely was a cover up. It just so happened to be 2,000 years ago. And it's a very, deliberate cover up back then of Jesus, kind of giving a little bit of away, but Jesus of Nazareth, where it's really Jesus the Nazarene. And that has been continued for 2,000 years now today, that's covered up, that, it's where he's from. No, it's who he is. I mean, once you know who he is, then it just sparks a whole rabbit hole of discussion and exploration of what that means if he's a Nazarene rather than he's from some town named Nazareth. And that was deliberately covered up.
Why is that important?
Because once you realize he's part of the Nazarene movement, then there's a lot of things that you can dive into that can be, I don't always like to, I don't want to go say some wrong.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's funny, before this, I was online on a 2-hour phone call with Religion News Service going over an interview that we had specifically about this topic because it's so deep. And she was like, we did an interview a week ago about this, and she's just so focused, and she's now going down the rabbit hole of the Nazarenes and just, whoa, it goes so deep. There's all of this historical documentation about this movement that I myself, as a lifelong Christian, never heard about. I don't see anyone else speaking about it, but there's so much historical documentation there about this movement that had very particular intentions. And the reason why it's relevant is because it all centers around the temple at the time of Christ and the animal sacrificial system, which again, I think as Christians, we don't really know the scale of what was actually happening in the temple. We think that there was just a cute lamb, sacrificed over, it's this beautiful scene and it's celebratory and it's this, it becomes a meal and it's this, but it's much different than that, which we cover in the film. And so I think the historical picture of what was actually happening there brings to light something that's very, very relevant in terms of the ethical treatment of animals argument.
What was it that prompted you to question all of this? As a Christian, why did you not just accept that story and that information that was putting forward? Why did you want to explore it more deeply?
Right. There were little seeds that were planted all through my life since I was a kid, just certain questions. I was deeply involved with, Bible study and Sunday school and all those things. But without getting into those little seeds, the big turning point was when I was a late teenager. I started doing the Daniel fast, which is a kind of Protestant Christian-based nutritional plan that became popular, where you refrain from animal products for a period of time, like a fast. And it's paired with scripture and all of these things because there was a biblical prophet named Daniel who was a slave in Babylon. And rather than eating all the slave food, which was meat and this and that, he said, I don't want that. I refrain from that. I just want pulses, seed-bearing plants in water. That's it. And it was a threat for him to do that. And they were trying to say, no, you can't do that. And he said, well, just give me 10 days, test me on this diet and see how I fare against the rest of the slaves in the kingdom. And he tested stronger, healthier, and wiser than all the other slaves. And so that's in the scripture. And there was a popular thing called the Daniel plan, which I started doing with my family. And somewhere in the process of doing that, something kind of awakened in me, a certain connection, the way that I felt. And it started raising a lot of early questions that then I'm like, well, if this is in the scripture, is there anywhere else in the scripture that talks about this? Because, man, I love meat. It was kind of, in a way, uncomfortable for me because I worked at the time I was working at a barbecue restaurant. But once those first questions raised, it sent me down a path of really, beginning to asking, well, what would Jesus do about this, and more specifically, rather than just the diet aspect, I started to become aware of my food choices in general and the impacts they make ethically. So
that's a pretty common kind of catchphrase, right? What would Jesus do?
Yeah.
That's kind of something that Christians live by.
Oh yeah, I got it on my wrist right here.
Right.
WWJD. It's a bracelet and a whole phrase. Yeah.
Right. Which gets to really the heart or one of the stories through the documentary. What was Jesus's position on the killing and consumption of animal foods?
Right.
You just mentioned there you were on, was it a 2-hour call? Really challenges someone that's Christian, right? When they're confronted with this information. What was her response to that?
Well, because she's a journalist, she can't say too much. We actually had a call with her the other week, and we were pressing her to ask her what her opinion was, right? That was her. We were asking her what her opinion was. She's like, well, I can't really give my opinion because I'm a journalist. But you can tell she's a journalist that deals with a lot of people in a movement, a current movement, which is called the deconstructionist movement, which is all around the world. There are people that still want to have faith of some kind, Christian faith, Judeo-Christian faith, but they're struggling with how it applies today and the inconsistencies and contradictions in certain scriptures and this and that. And so they deconstruct, that's where it comes from, their faith down to the rawest materials or rawest points and then rebuild it from there. So she interviews a lot of those kinds of people, and I can tell she probably herself through that process is going through her own process. And I could feel she wants to know, so she was really obsessing over this Nazarene movement and all the historical documentation and how do we know this is true? How do we know that? What is this? What is that? So,
yeah, I can see it putting people into an uncomfortable position, right? You kind of either have to read into it and perhaps eventually accept it and then change your actions, or write it off as vegan propaganda, which is probably something I'm sure that you've dealt with before with other documentaries.
Yeah, it's nice when, like, she's in a good example. When she's open, she really genuinely wants to know the truth. She doesn't have a block. She's just like, I want to get down to it. And then the more you go into it, it's like, wow, this is amazing. And it just is such a strong case for what we're revealing in the film. And that's what's with Cowspiracy, what the hell, Seaspiracy. When someone's trying to debunk it, they'll just look at the things that are debunking it. But if they're genuinely interested in seeing what the truth is, the more they go down that with an open mind and an open exploration, like, wow, the deeper you go into this, the more this is very, very legitimate. And this film particularly, when you have that attitude, you're gonna be like, wow, this is not only valid, but this is huge. This is transformative. This is massive. This is a massive historical transformation of Christianity and religion that really transformed the way, from here moving forward, will be seen and what it means to be a Christian. It's huge.